Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for joining today's conference, U.S. Disease Detections, International Impacts and Expectations Related to Exports of Animals and Animal Products. Please note that all audio lines have been muted for the duration of this call. However, you can submit written questions at any time. To do so, please use the chat panel in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and make sure to send your question to all panelists. You may also submit technical assistance tickets to the event producer. Please send a private message to me instead. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded, and with that, I'll turn the call over to Liz Fernandez. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Liz Fernandez with the Professional Development Services Branch, and I'd also like to welcome you to today's webinar. Our speaker for today is Elizabeth Spazio. Elizabeth is a third-year dual veterinary and Master of Public Health student at the Virginia-Maryland College of Veterinary Medicine. She has been interning with Veterinary Services Live Animal Imports and Exports for just over a year and hopes to work for APHIS post-graduation in 2022. Prior to attending veterinary school, Elizabeth graduated from Virginia Tech with a bachelor's in dairy science. From there, she began a career in pork manufacturing, working alongside USDA FSIS, where she developed a passion for food safety and disease mitigation, ultimately driving her towards achieving her lifelong goal of becoming a veterinarian. Elizabeth currently serves as the Hills Pet Nutrition Student Representative, Public Corporate Liaison, and College Ambassador. Also on the call today, assisting with questions during our question and answer period, is Dr. Shauna Siegel, the National Director of Live Animal Import and Export for USDA APHIS Veterinary Services, and Dr. Deborah Langford, who is a Senior Staff Veterinarian with VS Strategy and Policy, and Dr. Dawn Hunter, who works as a Trade Policy Advisor. And with that, I'm going to turn the webinar over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Liz. So good morning, and thank you everybody for joining us this morning. Before I get started, I would like to send a special thank you to Dr. Shauna Siegel, Dr. Deborah Langford, and Dr. Lance Bassage for their support in this presentation, as well as the Live Animal Exports and Animal Product Exports team. So when I start presentations, I really like to begin by providing the end goal of what you as the audience member should learn from this presentation. So the primary goal for today within the realm of live animals and animal product exports are the downstream effects that trade has and the steps taken to mitigate the loss of trade between countries, and to showcase why the collaborative work that federal and state veterinarians do is vital to the continuation of U.S. exports. So we all know that trade occurs on a daily basis, with animals leaving and entering the U.S. constantly. But what does happen when a disease is detected, throwing a wrench into that situation? I will begin by giving an overview of the main elements pertaining to export trade and animal diseases. And I'd like to break out the different categories of trade that we'll be discussing today into live animal exports and animal product exports. So live animals includes anything from poultry to equine, bovine, porcine, as well as their semen, embryos, oocytes, and fertile hatching eggs. Animal products is any products derived from animal origin. So this can include products such as milk, blood, bone meal, muscle meat, skins, offal products, pet foods, and many, many more. Now let's take a look at the different types of animal diseases that can affect trade between the U.S. and other countries. Again, I have broken this out into two different categories of disease. The first is new transboundary animal diseases. So these may be more familiar, known as a foreign animal disease. So they have never been seen within the U.S. before, and their prevalence causes significant impacts on animal or public health, as well as economic impacts. So the OIE defines via the FAO a foreign animal disease as those that cause significant economic, trade, and or food security importance for a considerable number of countries and can easily spread between countries and reach epidemic proportions. The FAO continues their definition to include that they cause high rates of death and disease in animals, thereby having serious socioeconomic and public health consequences, and also causing a constant threat to the livelihoods of livestock farmers. So a transboundary animal disease is what we're going to consider a foreign animal disease for this presentation. So it's also important to note that most OIE listed diseases of aquatic species are considered foreign animal diseases if found within the U.S. So a few examples of this include African swine fever, spring viremia of carp, hepatitis, and African horse sickness for our transboundary animal diseases. A recurrent animal disease is being described here as a notifiable animal disease that is not regularly prevalent within the U.S., but has been found here before. And so this may occur seasonally or just on occasion. And so examples of a recurrent animal disease include virulent Newcastle disease, notifiable avian influenza, whether that be low pass or high pass, vesicular stomatitis, and contagious equine metritis. What is trade restriction? Trade restriction is limitations set on the importation of U.S. animals and animal products that cannot meet the importing country's entry requirements. And this is usually due to the presence of disease. Now, trade restrictions are really protection for one's own country, and they do go both ways between countries. So when the U.S. is importing commodities from other countries, we have importing requirements to prevent the importation of any animal diseases, just as exporting countries do for us. So there's multiple forms of restrictions, which we'll go into later detail on, but they can include trade restrictions, trade stoppage, as well as control zones, and the details vary for each type of restriction. So in all, restrictions are not a one-size-fits-all. They vary greatly between countries and are very dependent upon the disease present. Export staff try their best to limit the range of geographic and commodity-specific limitations to keep as much trade open as possible. What's important to remember here is that the U.S. does not set trade restrictions or bans on exported animals or animal-derived products. Only the importing country can set these limitations. Again, who sets trade restrictions on U.S. exports? The importing country. So why then do some shipments not receive endorsement for exportation from the U.S. even when there is not a trade restriction from the importing country? To get some background, each live animal is required to be examined and tested for disease by an accredited veterinarian to certify the health of each animal prior to shipment. Similarly, products of animal origin require export certificates verifying the U.S. is free of foreign animal diseases such as African swine fever, rinderpest, FMD, and more. Additionally, each animal product may have additional certification language that the product must meet. So if any live animal or animal product cannot in its entirety meet those requirements, it can set a self-regulated restriction on that shipment from leaving the U.S. And again, these limitations are different for each importing country. The Federal Code of Regulations is also a limiting factor, regulating what is and is not acceptable for the exportation of animals and animal products from the U.S. This is where control zones and maintaining disease-free herds becomes vital for industries and brokers shipping animals internationally. Animal products and live animal staff establish relationships with countries to help mitigate conflict and speed up decision times where when and if a disease is detected. Who discovers these diseases in the first place? Well, it's our veterinarians who are at the front lines of animal health, who are the individuals making the suspect diagnoses. Private and public veterinarians, accredited veterinarians, are many times the first eyes seeing a reportable disease in an animal. It also includes state veterinarians and foreign animal diagnosticians who are frequently involved in determining these cases. So once a disease is detected, samples are sent to NVSL for confirmatory testing. NVSL is the National Veterinary Services Laboratory that conducts confirmatory testing for disease detections in animals and reports confirmed cases to the World Organization for Animal Health, also known as the OIE. NVSL is the only place that foreign animal diseases can be tested and diagnosed. These labs are present in Ames, Iowa, and Plum Island, New York. NVSL also serves as the International Reference Laboratory for OIE and the National Animal Health Lab Network for the U.S. So a fun fact to start out this slide, did you know that disease can travel around the globe in under 24 hours now? So think about how many people and animals that can impact in a single day. A prime example of this is what's occurring right now with COVID-19. 2019 records from the U.S. Meat Export Federation estimate pork exports to be valued at $7 billion and beef exports at $8 billion. So clearly, global trade is the economic engine of U.S. agriculture. At the same time, infectious diseases are fueled by our international trade. Trade creates markets for live animals and animal products, increases U.S. product value, and fosters economic growth. As trade continues to expand to open more markets, it also increases the risk for disease transmission. And that disease can result in economic loss in the form of trade restrictions or trade stoppage. This is why we have a system of steps that relies on veterinarians, trade staff, and stakeholders to ensure the health and well-being of animals transiting, whether that be interstate or internationally. Every $1 in agricultural exports generates an additional $1.30 in economic activity, and that is told by the USDA Foreign Ag Services. As the world's largest exporter of food and agricultural products, not only does the U.S. economy rely on preventing disease transmission, but so does the rest of the world. Disease spells disaster for current and future trade with international countries. In 2019, an estimated $135 billion would be lost if disease were to inhibit agricultural trade. So a prime example of this is the high-path avian influenza outbreak that occurred in 2014 to 2015. It affected 211 commercial flocks and 21 backyard flocks of birds and lasted 7 months. The economic losses were substantial, affecting not only poultry producers and industry employees, but also surrounding communities, the feed mills, slaughter facilities, farm stores, and more. The result was the destruction of 50 million birds and $3.3 billion in economic losses, making this the U.S.'s largest animal health emergency to date. Trade routes for agriculture are major gateways of trade for other commodities such as electronics, clothing, and international food. They also serve as representations of political tactics in maintaining a robust economy. So if we were to allow an infected animal or animal product to transit to a trading partner without attempts to control the disease, we would be solely responsible for introducing a disease into a country. So although someone somewhere is responsible for that introduction, our entire country might pay for that mishandling. Think about when a trade route has been shut down, even temporarily. It can cause major strain on producers, exporters, importers, and national agencies. It's everyone's responsibility to ensure that animals are kept healthy and free of disease. This slide gives a brief overview of how animals and animal products go from farm to international territory. And here is what international trade looks like at a glance. So both live animals and animal products begin the same way via the exporter checking the IREG's website. And IREG's is the International Export Regulations website. It's APHIS's website that houses all known export requirements for every country that the U.S. trades with. And it's vital to check to the IREG's website prior to export because requirements can change literally overnight. So once this has been done and any additional forms obtained, the exporter can move on to obtaining a health certificate or export certificate. This is done in collaboration and under the approval of an accredited DVM, as they must certify the health status of the animal being shipped. VHIS, or the Veterinary Export Health Certificate System, is the electronic platform for countries that accept electronic certificates. So in addition to export certificates, an import permit for the country of destination is needed. And import permits are shipment specific. For this step of the export process, the approval involves export trade staff, permit examiners, endorsing veterinarians, and trade staff officers within veterinary services. Finally, the commodities exit from the U.S. must be arranged ahead of time and in accordance with field and port veterinary CMOs, as well as the animal health technicians. A series of steps. This is a series of steps involving numerous people from all divisions of agriculture and animal health and comprises of private, state, and federal resources. You've gained an understanding of the pieces that go into export trade and what types of reportable animal diseases that can impact trade. Now let's put it all together and see how a disease does impact that trade and the necessary steps to ship an animal or an animal product internationally. When a reportable animal disease is detected within the U.S., the first step is to work with NVSO to determine the validity of a non-negative test result. So that is to say, yes, this is a truly positive case of X disease. Then official notification must be provided to the OIE for reportable animal diseases. So this is a requirement of all countries, not just the U.S. As we remember that the OIE is the World Organization for Animal Health, tracing and reporting transmissible animal diseases worldwide and setting standards of care. For each reportable animal disease confirmed, staff officers must assess the impact it will have on trade and move forward according to protocols and the Code of Federal Regulations. So now that we have a brief understanding of the general flow, let's take a look in a little bit more detail. Looking at that last slide in detail now, NVSL confirms test results of animal disease. While that is occurring, veterinary services needs to create a communication plan to notify trading partners. At the same time, certifying officials are informed according to the type of disease detected, being either a recurrent animal disease or a new transboundary animal disease. So a new transboundary animal disease would involve division-wide notice and more outreach than a recurrent animal disease. Not all diseases require OIE notifications before notifying the importing country. And sometimes NVSL confirmation and OIE notification occur simultaneously. Trade partners will receive the notification regarding confirmed reportable animal diseases within the U.S., And this can occur either by the OIE notice or from the OIE website, which all countries are able to view, or direct notification if prior agreements have been arranged for that specific disease. Again, the impact on trade must be assessed and determined, and the result communicated appropriately. At this point, the U.S. has done all that is required of them. However, sometimes there are additional steps that trading partners require in order to assess the situation. So trading partners may request more information than is present on the OIE report. And if this is the case, the U.S. trade staff from live animals or animal product exports will provide epidemiology reports, maps, case reports, or whatever is required. These steps are taken to help negotiate to lessen restrictions on trade, taking the area restricted from maybe countries down to a specific state, or from an affected state down to the exact counties, or even a smaller zone. So for products, additional steps may be that of informing a broader scope of stakeholders or industries. So for example, they might need to inform all pork product stakeholders versus only those that handle fresh pork products. However, all of this information is available on Veterinary Services website and the OIE website. Another aspect to consider when discussing animal diseases and trade is who is actually controlling these shipments. Forms of shipment controls vary depending on the commodity being exported, the country of destination, and the disease present in the U.S. So ultimately, exporters are responsible for the logistics of their shipments, which is another reason why utilizing the IREG website is vital prior to any export. Veterinary Services also informs stakeholders, such as government agencies to include FSIS or the Agricultural Marketing Services, and industry groups on the eligibility of exports based on the importing country requirements. Depending on the disease present, there may already be well-defined plans in place with explicit protocols to follow. So an example of this might be avian influenza or virulent Newcastle disease. Or those shipment controls may be more fluid in their response steps, with more frequent changes occurring throughout the outbreak. So this is why Veterinary Services reaches out to industry and federal stakeholders to advise them of the situation and ensure trading partner requirements are being met. Following these export requirements ensures that the U.S. can maintain and expand markets and builds trust with trading partners, which ties back into the connection between animal diseases and trade on a socioeconomic level. Ideally, for shipments already en route, we want them to continue to their destination. So for diseases the U.S. has prior bilateral agreements for, or the receiving country has protocols for, this might be possible. However, it is still up to the receiving country to accept the shipment. So trade protocols help shipments continue to their destination in light of disease presence. So let's take a look into trade agreements. Trade agreements open up routes for economic and political partnerships. These agreements are written settlements staff officers and importing country officials have negotiated on. And they can take many forms, including some you may have already dealt with. So these can include health certificates, regionalization protocols, and import permits. And they involve the constant communication flow between regulating officials. If we don't follow mutually agreed upon terms, trade partners can restrict or shut current trade down completely and prevent future agreement opportunities. So there are numerous examples of these agreements that can be found on the USDA APHIS Animal Health Export website. I'm going to categorize trade bans into two subsets here. So these are not official categories, but they will help in the general understanding of trade flow. So an official trade restriction is written documentation declaring a restriction on trade for a specific live animal species and or the respective products derived from that species. So this may come in the form of a memorandum from the importing country to the senior veterinary medical officer in charge of the affected commodity. On the other hand, we have unofficial trade restrictions. So this is where no new written language has been created. Rather, it's the language already in the export health certificates that will naturally inhibit diseased animals and their affected animal products from leaving the U.S. So unofficial restrictions can even come from the importing country. So in light of disease presence within the U.S., a country may choose to stop issuing permits for import until they approve of the U.S.'s disease response or disease-free status. The other unofficial form of trade restriction is on the U.S. side. So if the commodity being exported cannot meet the requirements of the health certificate and permit, they will not receive veterinary service endorsement. This brings into play a good reminder for industry and broker stakeholders that they should frequently check the animal health import-export web pages for updated health certificates, permits, and country restrictions. And this would be in addition to any written or verbal communication directly from veterinary service officials because of how fast trade changes can be made. What does this mean for trade? In short, it means every reportable animal disease kickstarts its own chain reaction for trade. Trade restrictions are incredibly dependent on the animal disease detected and the trading partner. But not all countries have the same concerns regarding foreign animal diseases, and not all countries react the same to such. However, if trade is impeded, there are three main forms in which this may occur. So the first is a trade restriction. We also have control zones. And the third is a true complete stoppage of all trade pertaining to the foreign animal disease at hand. So let's take a look at these each in detail. Trade restrictions of animal product export. Remember, trade restrictions can only be set by the importing country, not the U.S. The trade restrictions may also be termed a trade ban, as they are both related to the action of some trade markets being inhibited in some way. Animal product exports have been able to negotiate with some countries regarding specific diseases and the effect a confirmed positive case may have on transiting shipments. So these negotiations are important to maintain open markets and keep animal industries running. Again, trade restrictions are specific to the country of import. So IREGs, or again, the International Animal Product Export Regulations website, is utilized heavy to notify exporters of country-specific restrictions for animal origin products. When any trade restrictions affect animal origin products, veterinary services export animal product staff must communicate that information to the respective regulating authority. So that being Food Safety Inspection Service for meat, the Agricultural Marketing Services for dairy and eggs, as well as the FDA for honey and dairy, and NOAA for aquaculture. Please note that this is not an all-inclusive list of the examples for animal products and the regulating authorities. Trade restrictions for live animal exports. Again, remember that trade restrictions can only be set by the importing country, not the U.S. Restrictions can be in various forms and may be permanent or temporary depending on the disease status and the strain found within the U.S. Most often, restrictions are set by the language provided in health certificates. When an animal is unable to meet the requirements, the health certificate cannot be endorsed. Another form of self-restriction of trade is through control zones. Control zones are specific demarcations of disease-affected areas. Live animal trade restrictions can also be made by the importing country. So these restrictions can be in official notification form or unofficially by halting the issuing of permits. Although this takes place at a high level, it is the actions of the people on the ground that affect how long the restriction lasts and the stringency a country places on live animal exports relative to the disease status in the U.S. So following protocols and avoiding transiting control zones for international shipments aids in reopening these markets faster. I've just mentioned control zones. Control zones are set by the USDA and are dependent upon disease. They are also geographically based trade restriction zones, and they're usually within a kilometer radius around a disease area. You can see in the picture that there are small areas blocked out, indicating individual zones of disease, as well as a blue ring representing the 10-kilometer radius in which exports are ineligible to come from. If you wish to export internationally, susceptible commodities cannot come out of a control zone. Doing so will make them ineligible for export and will be a loss of time and money for everyone involved. So again, if you are shipping internationally, a commodity cannot enter a control zone, nor can susceptible commodities, whether that be live animals and animal products, be derived from a control zone. The complete trade stoppage is a total obstruction of trade to countries for specific commodities. So this is imposed by a trading partner, and the complete stoppage of trade for an entire commodity, is rare. So rather, trade restrictions are more commonly implemented, impeding smaller amounts of trade. So if a trade stoppage were to occur, it's going to typically be for a true foreign animal disease or new transmissible animal disease, where the U.S. has minimal mitigation protocols to reduce or protect trade during an outbreak. Within animal products, if a new foreign animal disease is detected, a full trade stop may occur and is expected to last years, cutting off trade partnerships and economic gain. So trade stoppage are not always due solely to disease presence, but will be for the purposes of this presentation. There may also be lateral effects that are felt. So there can be trade restriction on all commodities containing specific animal product and non-animal origin products that have shown to transmit the disease. So how does veterinary services let other trade staff officers and industries know about all of these trade partnerships occurring constantly? Internally within veterinary services, new trade alerts are posted to the IREG's website for both live animals and animal products. Actions to distribute these new changes to trade must be made swiftly and widely available. So email news is via case reports, mini memos, or emails informing the appropriate staff members of the situation. For animal products, they have the APED, or the Animal Product Export Database, that is utilized. And similarly, for live animals, they have the Live Animal Export Database. Both of these databases are for internal veterinary services use only. So emails and conference calls are additional means of distribution utilized frequently. So this is why it's vital to join meetings and conference calls. For the public is another vital component for information dissemination regarding trade updates. Many of you may have visited or attended some of these updated platforms. IREG's website is also utilized for public knowledge. So as a refresher from the introduction, IREG is where all exporters should go prior to obtaining a health certificate or export permit as IREGS contains additional animal, product, and country-specific export restrictions. More formal means of communication may be posted or distributed via letters, emails, or the APHIS stakeholder registry. It is also important to note that any information regarding trade restrictions sent to internal agencies within veterinary services is also communicated to the respective industry groups. So this can include pork checkoff, the Poultry and Egg Council, bovine groups, and the like. It's the responsibility of the veterinary medical officers to disseminate this information. And I have also provided a link to the IREGS website on this slide. For new foreign animal disease, the same means of communication as just described are still utilized. However, there is typically more marketing and widespread information dissemination than for recurrent diseases. So again, this is why it's very vital to join calls, meetings, and check the websites regularly. So some of this information can be found on the APHIS media website as press releases or video clips from the Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue. And as a first occurrence of a foreign animal disease to the U.S. is of major concern, these communications are handled by legislative and public affairs. As with any reportable animal disease, OIE reports and industry communications are made available. Just as trade restrictions are set, there are steps for it to be lifted. The country that sets the restriction must be the one to remove it. In the same fashion that trade restrictions can be set, they vary in the ways that they can be lifted, whether it be for a recurrent animal disease or a new transboundary animal disease. The most simplistic and desired form of trade restriction would be that of self-restriction. So this unofficial form of restriction is resolved as soon as the requirements on the health certificates are valid again. Other times, a trading partner may require closeout reports and or a final OIE reports in order to open markets back up. When APHIS submits information for a trade restriction to be lifted, communication is usually via international services. The goal, of course, is to resume permit issuance to all countries previously restricted and possibly open up more markets in the near future. Some of the same steps are utilized for new transboundary animal diseases as for recurrent animal diseases. And that's where we see that. So bans are often require communication with our trading partner, including the provision of closeout summaries and the final OIE report. In some instances, restrictions may be immediately rescinded, while other trading partners may take longer to review the information, follow up surveillance data, and vote to restore or recognize freedom from disease. Ultimately, no restriction on trade is a one-size-fits-all situation, nor is the resumption of that trade. Every animal disease, every country, and every occurrence are all unique and are treated as such. Trade is the fluid exchange of goods, changing in relation to numerous other factors evolving throughout the world. So in short, it takes the efforts of everyone involved, from producers, growers, manufacturers, veterinarians, state veterinarians, federal trade staff, and more to maintain working relationships with trading partners and to keep the U.S. free from foreign animal diseases. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. We do have one question in the chat. The first question is, what happens to export products / live animals that are in transit when trade restrictions are announced?
Yeah, this is Shanna Siegel, and the answer to that is it depends. and it's going to depend on what the disease is and what the commodity is and what country it's going to. Some countries will allow certificates endorsed before, or animals or products certified before the U.S. was affected to continue to ship. Others will not. If shipments are actively on the water or in the air, then usually exporters will let us know, or we'll get communication with that importing country about that shipment to see what, if anything, needs to be done to ensure smooth release of that shipment upon arrival.
Okay. The next question is, what agency, go ahead.
This is Dawn Hunter. I just want to add to that for products, a lot of times they can be heat treated to mitigate the disease of concern. So depending on whether it is a raw, fresh frozen product or a heat-treated product that has been heated to the point where it mitigates for the disease, it may not be of concern. But other than that, it's all for the reasons that Dr. Siegel has provided for live animals as well.
Okay. The next question is, what agency is responsible for trade negotiations between U.S. and other countries, and how important is mediation in negotiations for lifting trade restrictions with the transboundary animal disease?
All right, I'll get the first half of that. This is Shanna, and then Dawn, I'll have you as trade advisor cover the second half of that. So basically, USDA Veterinary Services is responsible for the technical component of all trade negotiations for live animals and animal products. That said, there can be other partner agencies such as International Services or the Foreign Agricultural Service that are involved in those negotiations and processes. And then, Dawn, would you mind commenting on the mediation angle for lifting trade restrictions when they're not, lifting self-restrictions?
Sure. I just want to add, first of all, that each agency, including USDA, which would be APHIS or AMS or FSIS, do negotiate for trade agreements. We do this with the assistance of FAS and or USTR as needed. USTR is the United States Trade Representative. If we are unable to come to a technical agreement, then a lot of times those additional agencies will be involved. Regarding the lifting of trade restrictions, if there's a prior agreement that outlines when trade restrictions and how trade restrictions will be implemented, they'll also outline how and when they will be lifted, under what circumstances. If we have a trade partner who has implemented restrictions and we don't have a prior agreement, then negotiation and discussion is very important in getting those bans removed. So, for instance, an example is the country of Iraq. Iraq will review the OIE website. They will implement bans against whatever country. For instance, the United States, Iraq implemented a ban for the state of South Carolina because of highly pathogenic avian influenza. And even though we have sent our closeout report to the OIE on August 5th, Iraq still has yet to remove that ban. And so we have subsequently written a letter that is signed by post to provide to Iraq requesting that they lift that ban. And either they can, respond back, or they can lift the ban, or they can ask for additional information. But we're always trying to negotiate. That's why we try to negotiate protocols in advance so that we don't have to go through these additional steps and take additional time. So if you have any other questions on that, we'll be glad to answer them.
We do have one additional question. What do you do with animals that have died during import?
This is Shanna. So if you're talking about import into the United States, any animals that are dead upon arrival are refused entry. For animals that we regulate, livestock and the livestock diseases that we regulate on import, all those animals are held in either in import quarantine upon arrival. They go through thorough exam as well as all their required testing, and animals are not released from those import quarantine facilities until we have negative test results for the diseases that we regulate on import, which vary by species.
We have another question that says, are there countries that do not list their import requirements? And if so, how do the exporters proceed?
Yes. So the IREGs, our website, that contains information about the export requirements for countries that we have official communications with. There are a lot of countries that we either don't have general communications with, or we may not have had a specific conversation about a specific type of animal or product. In those cases, if you go to the IREGs and the country-specific page does not contain information for the specific type of animal or product that you're interested in exporting, the first step is to contact that importing country to see if there are any requirements. Just because our website does not contain information does not mean that export requirements don't exist. In those cases, a lot of those shipments without negotiated requirements or protocols behind them, those are the shipments that tend to occur based off of an import permit, where the exporter or importer would contact an official in the receiving country, ask what the requirements are for that, and then those would be issued in writing, again, often in the form of an import permit, which is why those were described as shipment specific.
Yeah, and this is Dawn Hunter. I'll just add to that we do strongly encourage U.S. exporters to contact their importer in whatever country to request what the requirements are. If the case is that we don't have any posted on the IREGs. If it's necessary, we can work through the posts that we have all over the country. We have, that work at the embassies and consulates. We have our own folks who work there in veterinary services. We also have folks from the Foreign Ag Service and other parts of the agency that can help us out. But oftentimes, politics can get in the way of those types of requests, and so it is more highly encouraged that the exporter work with their importer to get that information.
Okay, at this time we don't have any other questions in the chat box. We'll wait a couple of minutes. I'll just read a couple announcements that I have in case. Oh, we just got one. That's what I love. When live animals are imported, they must meet USDA import requirements. When the animals are released by USDA, is the receiving state notified? If the receiving state has additional requirements, is this addressed in any way by USDA prior to release?
Yeah, so all U.S. imports are recorded in DSPS, and all state animal health officials have access to that system so that they can see what's destined for their states. There are a few exceptions where states are notified about incoming shipments. Those are usually related to restricted slaughter shipments. In general, there is not shipment-specific direct communications related to imports. Again, VSPS is the system used to capture that information that state animal health officials have access to.
Okay. I just want to give everyone a heads up that we do have a couple more webinars scheduled. And on September 3rd, we're having a webinar on the topic of complexity analysis, and on September 10th, the topic is going to be EMRS to go. So make sure to watch your emails for these webinars and additional webinars scheduled in September. We've got a bunch. And just a reminder, if anybody has any ideas for webinars that the BSNPEP can explore for emergency preparedness, please feel free to contact us. You can find all these other webinars on vaccine and many other topics on the PEP video gallery online, which is posted on the APHIS USDA Animal Health Training and Development Video Gallery. And the video gallery is listed on all of our webinar announcements. And if we don't have any other questions, I would like to thank our speakers today for doing this presentation. And I'd also like thank everybody who attended the webinar. And with that, I think we will conclude our webinar. Have a great afternoon.
That concludes our
Thank you all.
Thank you for using Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.